is long, hard, difficult to get a read on, and one of my favorite things. Fantasy books, of course. You thought I was gonna say men. That too. Hello and welcome back to First Page Critiques. I'm your host, Professor Katie. I don't have my glasses today because I'm very discombobulated filming this. If you can hear any miscellaneous huffs in the background, it is in fact my dog. And today we're going to be focusing on my favorite genre, adult fantasy. Preview. I read a lot of adult fantasy, so I can in fact make another video in the future if this is a genre that you like and want to hear more of my thoughts on. If you're new here, my name is Katie and I have a literature degree. It's not actually in that pamphlet. It's up on the wall, but I can't get it in the shot, so. Damn it, it's really warm today too. Every single time. Basically, I do not want my skills to get rusty. So I'm gonna be analyzing and talking about techniques that books use in their first lines and first pages. As always, with everything on the internet, make sure to use your critical thinking skills and take every piece of advice with a pinch of salt. Once again, I let my followers and friends over on Instagram pick what genre I was going to critique this week, as well as some of the books. So if you wanna say in what video I do next, you can follow me over on Instagram at Writer of Scribbles. So without further ado, let's get into it. Let's start with my favorite fantasy, which is City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. While this is literally one of my favorite book series, I'm not gonna lie to you, the opening is not my favorite on this list. I do actually really like the first line of "he was an easy mark," especially because this line gets used over and over again throughout the course of the story. There's a nice kind of cinematic parallels that occur in this line. What I do really love about this page is we are not immediately thrust into any kind of world building. We are right here with a normal woman named Nari who is going to cheat two men who are coming to her stall, station, shop. We're also given the time of day, a little bit about the setting, and a little bit about the religious background of the area. Later we'll learn that this is taking place in Cairo after the invasion of the French, which tells me that it is very late 18th century, very early 19th century. And from the way that Nari talks about Cairo and the way that Turks need to stay away and such, we can infer that she is in fact Egyptian. It's a good contextual note and a good voice within the story to really cement the reader within a viewpoint, so we know how we're looking through the world. If Nari was French or Turkish, the sentences would fall in a very different way, but since Nari is Egyptian and her home has been invaded over the course of her life, it is going to have a very different tone and style. And that is also something that ends up becoming thematic throughout the series of invasion and colonization. Good to see for your own consistency if you are writing the characters through their lens and through their viewpoint, and ensuring that the sentences that you are constructing are setting the reader within a certain viewpoint, because no narrative is without its own slant. In a way, whether it's political or moral or those kinds of things, it's good to know where your character falls and then structure the narrative and the prose accordingly. We learn in the third paragraph that Nari is not one for dawn prayer, but she is in fact a little bit religious. However, she can be swayed to get up early for money, which is an interesting character note. We can infer there's something going on with her financials, which as a woman in the 18th century, not shocking. And then we get a description of the men approaching her. They have light features and expensive coats, so she suspects that they're Turkish, but she finds the Turks snobbish. So then again, we're just continually reminded the framework that we are working with within the narrative and within our main character. But they want discretion, so hence the early time and maybe a little bit more moolah. So in terms of first pages, this doesn't give us a whole lot to work with, but it does set it up for the rest of the chapter, and I actually find the second page to be extremely successful when it comes to setting up story and character stakes. What it does do really well is give Nari a very distinctive voice, which is very important, I think, within fantasy, especially if it's multi-POV. There are two other POVs within the book, and I think starting with Nari's point of view is extremely smart and definitely the way to go when it comes to this story. We start with a very typical beginning with a woman who is in the human world, and Nari is in fact the only POV that is human or is in the human world. The other two POVs, spoiler alert, are Jinn. If you didn't know what the concept of this book was, it's Jinn. So our character is starting out in the human world in a relatively average life, and then at the exciting incident, her life will change forever. If we started with the Jinn's point of view, it would have been more interesting and I think more of a fantasy hook, especially since Ali is my personal favorite character, but it then would have been really jarring to go back to the human world with seemingly no connection to it if we would have started with the Jinn. I think this first page is a great example of why you shouldn't really judge a book by its first page. And first pages are definitely not everything. Obviously, a book is a whole, A book is a whole summation of words. And I think in this day and age, we are very easy to critique and very, short attention span. The first page has to hook us immediately or else we're wondering why are we here. But I do think this sort of beginning is decent for what it is, and it does really set up the story in a prose and voice kind of way. This book and this trilogy are so fantastic. So if you haven't picked up City of Brass, I highly recommend it. And I hope this first page was successful enough to get you to keep reading. So next, instead of a fantasy, I decided to DNF. Since I haven't DNF'd very many fantasies, I decided to go with a really popular fantasy. And one that is considered a staple within the fantasy genre. And so of course, I had to select Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, mostly because I have in fact read this one. I've read the entire series. And TV show? What TV show? I don't know a TV show. So something that is kind of interesting about Game of Thrones is every book includes a prologue, and I kind of went back and forth on whether I should do the prologue or the first page, and so ultimately I decided I would do both and compare and contrast them. I'm not the biggest fan of prologues. I tend to write them and then throw them out and scrap them later because they're just not necessary. I think in this case, it works somewhat. This page is nothing to write home about. The prologue is directly related to a lot of the events within the novel, so at least it isn't just completely random and thrown out there and you never really learn why it's there. It isn't really a mystery as to why this is here. But to be quite honest, I genuinely don't care about these characters. And there's a little bit of character soup, despite the fact that there's only 3 of them. I had to read this page twice to get anything really concrete out of it and understand what they're saying, and they don't have really distinct voices at this point. Basically what I gathered is Garrett is old, Royce is a dick, and Will is the other guy. They're searching for a bunch of dead people. They're called wildlings. We don't get a definition for wildlings. We just know they're dead or supposedly dead. There's a Sir Royce, so assuming he's some kind of aristocracy or nobility of some sort. So he calls the shots even though Garrett is older. He's cocky, and there is a bit of a conflict between Royce and Garrett, and they're conflicted over whether they should be continuing to try to find these bodies. Apparently, our third character, Will, has seen them and saw that they are dead and says that dead men sing no songs, so essentially meaning they'll learn nothing from them because they're dead and the dead don't talk. And of course, right after that, we're treated to immediate misogyny. Never believe anything you hear at a woman's tit. Okay, great, thanks. Love it. And then the rest of the page is just continuous arguing and talking about the fact that it is in fact getting darker and night is falling. This first page does in fact have conflict. It does set up the 3 men for the events of the prologue, but there is something about it that doesn't really whet my appetite. There's nothing really super memorable about this page or particularly engaging. In fact, this page doesn't really show off Martin's capability for crafting really wonderful sentences and beautiful prose. Later on within the series, and even within this prologue itself, he describes with quite beautiful, vivid detail the forest and the others and a couple of the other things that are happening within it. And it does take until page 8 of a prologue to get to the true conflict of the chapter. To be honest, I think I would have sped this up, or maybe I would have started with Will actually finding the bodies, and it just would have been a lot more interesting, I think, in terms of the fact that this is your first page your audience is going to be reading in this super thick book, super long series, and it's a really boring first page. I'm sorry. So does the prologue hold up? No, not really. First page, however, of the first chapter, I think does a lot better. The first chapter of Game of Thrones officially is a Bran chapter, and Bran is one of the more interesting characters within the Game of Thrones series. And because it's a fantasy, we have to start with a description of the morning. Clear and cold, because we're in the north. So we start with this very classic description of the end of summer, but then we immediately have our first turn that gives us a little bit of a twist, a little bit of intrigue. Our characters are going to see a man beheaded. Now that is a way to start a book. Bran is nervous with excitement, which if you're thinking that's a little bit strange, it is. And we learn a little bit later that he is quite young. He's only 7 years old. So he doesn't understand the ramifications of beheading or death itself, which eventually he'll find out quite intimately. He's just genuinely excited that he's going with his Lord Father and his brothers to see the king's justice done. So that's why he's excited. It makes sense. He's quite naive because he's 7. So yeah, taking a 7-year-old child to a beheading, that's a choice in parenting. Then we get a bit of interesting lore drop within the next paragraph, and Martin does a really good job of weaving it here together, especially because our narrator is 7, so these tales are things that he has heard quite recently and are probably part of his everyday life. It's also showing a bias towards wildlings, which becomes a point of contention and conflict throughout the entirety of the novels. But it's also laced with fable and myth and legend, which is an incredibly important part of the story. So much of this story, so much of the Song of Ice and Fire is steeped in old tradition and mythos and legends, in the darkness of our our past. But as with all of Martin's storylines, we are drawn immediately back into the very humanistic side of things, into the present, into the here and now, because the man who is being executed is not a wildling. He is not someone with teeth. He's not someone who's drinking blood out of polished horns. You know, he doesn't look like a slaver, slayer, or thief. Theoretically, he just looks like a man who is old and scrawny and is bound hand and foot. He's just a regular man who has lost a lot, presumably physically and also mentally. So that's how our first page of the first chapter of Game of Thrones goes. I think it is a much better setup for not only this chapter and the beginning act of this book, it's also a really great setup on a thematic level. Justice, prejudice, legend, faith, humanity, mythos, all of those things and how they interconnect, which is something that is present throughout the entirety of the book and through which all of the events hinge on. Thematically, I really like the first page of the first chapter, and I think it is quite successful, and it follows really nicely. Overall, still think this is a pretty decent fantasy. However, I think there are much more interesting things being done in current fantasies and fantasies we're seeing being brought out now by more diverse authors who are giving us more than just a medieval political fantasy. I'm kind of sick of the super history entrenched medieval fantasy myself, you know, it's okay. It has its time and place, but I think there's a lot better fantasies out there than this one. Take with it what you will. We all need to start somewhere, and it is a very foundational text to a lot of the fantasy that we have today, especially adult fantasy. Take with that what you will. Next up is a new fantasy slash a recent read. I just recently finished this book, and it is a book that came out in 2022, so I think it'd be interesting to look at a really recent release. And this is City of Dusk by Tara Sim. I really enjoyed this book. First of all, I gotta show y'all the dedication because honestly, iconic, amazing, show-stopping, never been better. Truly love that for her. This book does in fact have like a prologue, but it's not really a prologue in the way that Game of Thrones had a prologue. It's literally just like maybe a half a page of text, 500 words. And it's kind of like a teaser for some nefarious deeds and things that are happening later on in the story. And it's not really a full page, so I'm not gonna get into it. And you know, it's a very nice first page, but it doesn't come back into fruition until about like 3/4 of the way through the book. This first page, which this book is kind of massive, so this first page does have a little bit more than the other ones, which I think is some of the downfall of maybe my versions of the fantasy books, is that they are a little bit smaller. This is like a mass market paperback. Our final one is quite slim and small as well. Just something to keep in mind as well with these first page critiques. I am trying to do my best, but I have the books that I have available to me, and I'm just going to do the first page that I currently have. So our first sentence introduces us to the character immediately and gives us a really interesting note and detail about her. She is not a good person, nor does she have any intention of becoming one. So we now know exactly what kind of story path she is going to be taking throughout the novel. The only irksome thing is the use of passive voice, which I will harp on until the end of days. I am not sorry, Wallace. But the sentence gives such strong character voice that I will let the passiveness of it slide just this once. So we know exactly who we are dealing with right off the bat, at least for one of the POVs. She says that she's fine with this. She's fine by that. So we know that she's probably going to be a little bit villainous. But we do have a mention of a house with a capital H and a mention of a villa, which is pretty fancy, so it's giving rich girl vibes. We have nice use of the word coiled. I love a good strong verb. She feels it even under the shadow of a market awning, so nice use of place and season. We get our first piece of world building with a nice description of an alcoholic drink that is being served, and then we're given some description of some of the things that are being sold at this market, so we know kind of what we're dealing with, where we're at. Some of the descriptions are quite typical, but I think they're nice in general. Then we kind of zoom back into our main character, and she and the audience are forced to acknowledge this building that she is desperately trying to ignore. Get a description of the building, although does sandstone really shimmer? I don't think it does. That's something I've noticed is like, why is the sandstone shimmering? Like, I don't think sandstone shimmers. I guess maybe it's like a heat mirage, but I might have picked a different descriptive word here. In the next paragraph, we have our first turn. It's quite lovely for a prison. Nice little twist, unexpected. We're looking at a prison that has a very beautiful spiral design. A lovely building disguising the prison underneath. It's also a very nice piece of foreshadowing, which considering you know what happens in the rest of the book, I can say, but that is a detail that comes back. Also, this book is a great floppy paperback. Lovely. Next, there's a little hint of Tesea's powers, the shadows twitching at her fingertips. And she's quite jumpy, so we have kind of an emotional state. Then we learn that Tesea knows a thief's mentality, so perhaps she does thievery or is involved in other nefarious deals. And then we learn that there are more guards than usual, which begs the question, why? What's going on here? So all in all, this page does do a lot of groundwork for the rest of the chapter. We learn about her character, the hint at her powers, her state of mind, physically where she is at, perhaps her social status. We know that she lives in a city that is potentially more dangerous now, or there is some kind of scheme that is afoot that requires extra guards. Overall, a good, well-balanced first page that I think is quite successful. I mean, I was still reading it. First page is good enough to read and finish. And finally, we're on to a fantasy that I haven't read. So I gave you guys 4 choices on Instagram, and you guys chose The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. First of all, The smell of this book is exquisite. Oh, it's just like the inside of a Barnes & Noble. And the floppiness of it cannot be understated. Literal perfection. I love a floppy paperback. Like, look at that. Just stunning. Absolutely stunning. Things I love in bookmaking that have nothing to do with it. Anyway, onto the content of the actual first page. I actually really like this first page because we're immediately thrown into a scenario. I like how the first line is dialogue. It snaps you in quickly. And when I was writing the script for this video, I actually flipped to the next page and continued reading. So that's how I feel like you know that this book was successful in hooking you immediately. I was into it. So we don't actually have a lot of sensory details in this first page, which is usually something I don't enjoy. But I think the way that it's written, it is intentional. Our main character, Rin, is being poked and prodded at, and I think we can assume the room that she's in is fairly sterile and featureless. We learn that she's being tested for something. We don't know what yet, but apparently it's something that can be cheated on. We're given details that she is in a formless blue sack, and the exam smock is slightly too large for her, the sleeves draping over her hands. Perhaps she's smaller in stature. And then we're told that last year 12 students tried to cheat. And so they're taking this very seriously because of that, and that's why they're strip searching teenagers, I assume. I assume they're teenagers. Are they teenagers? I don't know. And they're seeing if they're on drugs. You know, as one does. So overall, I don't have a ton to say about this page because it is so successful, and the fact that it is just quick and fast-paced. There's a sort of stripped downness to the prose, so there isn't a lot for me to just comment on when it comes to like the world building, because we're not in the world yet. There's no exquisite details here that are giving me a super vivid idea of who the character is, but I think what is so successful about it is the fact that it is so fast-paced and it feels like it would be a very quick and addictive read. I do tend to enjoy heavier detailed pages, but I think the snappiness and immediateness of it is something that is really successful with it, and I think something that is important to consider when you're writing pages. Because, you know, you can read a really heavy, dense fantasy like City of Dusk, or even Game of Thrones is really dense on the description. But when you really think about it, what is going to keep people reading your books? I think hooking them in, and even if this isn't exactly the writing style I personally prefer, it is successful in the fact that it gets you into it, brings you into the world immediately. We're not dawdling, we're not zooming in and out. We are very solidly in this character's point of view, and it is very interesting the conflict and intrigue we have going on here. She's going to take a test, presumably very important based on how they're treating her. Again, I can see why this book is so popular, feels like it'd be addictive and easy to read, and that is the Poppy War, which is moved up on my TBR to read. So in conclusion, these were 4 very different openings to 4 very different books. And what I love is the variation in each of them. However, I will say they all stick pretty close to the conventions of the genre, which involves immediately submerging the reader into a new world and weaving in the details as you go along and letting them be a little bit confused. Part of the great thing about fantasy is you are learning the rules, and eventually as you start learning, it is quite satisfying to understand the rules of a new world. At least for me. I think in current publishing, we are seeing a trend towards quicker and quicker starts and less of this meandering through and deep detailed descriptions right at the beginning. More and more immediate action that then kind of has a tapering off effect after you've been drawn in. There isn't as much build up to the immediate pull, or maybe that's just what I tend to gravitate towards and what I tend to read. There are in fact biases here that I haven't acknowledged, but I own books that I would want to read. Let me know which opening you found was your favorite or was most successful to you. And let me know what genres you would want to see covered in an upcoming video. Again, I have a lot of fun with this series, and definitely let me know some of your thoughts on these openings and what you would change about them. Let me know what you think about the current state of the adult fantasy market. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a like down below. It tells me you enjoy this kind of content and would like to see more of it in the future. I'm going to try to do these monthly. I don't know about May, but we're gonna be trying to do it. And I did hear you in the comments of the last one. I will be doing subscriber first pages and first lines of your books that you would want to submit to me. So make sure you're watching my community tab and my Instagram if you want to know when that's happening. I probably won't do it for a couple of months because I would kind of like to build up a stock of these videos so you can kind of see how I do it, how I critique things, how I look at them, and kind of give myself a little bit more credibility when it comes to, you know, my style when it comes to critiquing things. If you want to see more of my rambling face, make sure you do subscribe. May Chaos Reign, an event hosted by the Chaos Queens, is coming up, so I'm gonna have a lot of content for that, as well as my 2-year YouTube anniversary. So there's a lot of stuff you're not gonna want to miss. Thank you so much for watching again, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!